Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Smart Growth America's Equity Summit. Yesterday, about 1,900 of you joined us to talk about various issues of equity. And we ended about 1 p.m., just about 1 hour after the end of our conversation about racial equity. The federal government announced that they were doing a whole of government approach on racial equity. So the question for you guys is, was that a coincidence, or did our work together catalyze work on racial equity in the government space? Just joking, who knows? Just wanted to say hello, and now I'm going to hand you over to our host, Michael, for some administrative remarks.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the second day of the 3-day virtual summit organized by Smart Growth America. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse, a project of the National Smart Growth Network that includes a website, smartgrowth.org, where you can sign up to participate in webinars like these on a variety of smart growth and planning topics. I'm here to serve as your host as we continue to convene an exciting group of experts, practitioners, and policymakers to discuss how to center improving racial equity in smart growth work. This impressive lineup of speakers are discussing how to promote equity in housing and land use, looking at why Black and brown businesses are key to neighborhood vitality, and how to right the wrongs of past damaging transportation decisions and to promote restorative justice. This series is being recorded and will be available online after the event at smartgrowthamerica.org. We also hope that you will share your thoughts throughout the day on social media. You can tag us at SmartGrowthUSA and with the hashtag for the day, which is #SmartGrowthEquity. We'd love to hear what is resonating with you as each day unfolds. We're going to start again today, as we did yesterday, with the same question as a poll for the audience. We understand that a number of you were here yesterday, but the audience is not quite the same. So we'd like to see who is with us and to share that information with you. So with that, you should see a poll on your screen that asks how you'd rank your expertise or comfort in improving racial equity through your work. And again, there's a 1 to 5. You can select any of these. We'll give you a few seconds here to respond, and then we'll close it, and I will share the results with everybody. And if you are having any issue with responding to the poll, sometimes you're in full screen mode. You need to exit that so that you can actually answer. And it looks like about 40% of our audience already has. So thank you for participating today. We do have a few polls like this before we get started. So thanks for participating. It's really good information for us and hopefully also for you to understand who's in the audience. So today, the most popular category is number 2. I know that I'm not an expert, 56%, 25% have been at it for a minute. 9% are both total novices and know what they're doing, so there's a range there. And 1% of our audience could have been speaking today. So maybe you'll be part of one of our future participating programs. Before we get started, we'd like to take a moment to thank our presenting sponsors for their support in making this event possible. This 3-day virtual event was made possible by Citi. Citi's Action for Racial Equity represents unprecedented effort to leverage Citi's core business capabilities and the Citi Foundation's philanthropy to help address racial equity and justice in the U.S. Our gratitude also goes out to EPA's Office of Community Revitalization, Office of Environmental Justice, and Conflict Prevention and Resolution Center for their support. And lastly, the Maryland Department of Planning is not only a presenting sponsor, but has provided immense technical support by running the summit each day this week. Finally, closed captioning for Smart Growth America's Equity Summit today was sponsored by AARP. AARP's Livable Communities Hub is a rich source for free resources for local leaders on how to make housing, transportation, and public spaces work better for people of all ages and abilities. Visit aarp.org/livable to read more and to sign up for their newsletter. You can also sign up for AARP's Livable Communities newsletter directly from your phone by texting Livable to 50757 to get regular updates on free resources and tools. And those who need to use the CC, we will be dropping that into the chat box occasionally if you want to turn that on. Next, we are excited about today's schedule. Smart Growth America's Chris Zimmerman will get us started today. Chris is the Vice President of Economic Development and Director of the Governor's Institute on Community Design. An economist by training, his team at SGA was behind the production of Unrealized Gains, a report released in late 2020 about the impact of opportunity zones on minority-owned and legacy businesses. After that, Smart Growth America's president and its CEO, Calvin Gladney, will return to lead today's signature panel, which is Prepare, Prioritize, and Promote, how supporting Black and Brown businesses is a key to smart growth, followed by a Q&A. You can submit questions at any time during the event by using the Questions tab in the control panel on your screen, and we will share as many of these with the panel as time allows during the Q&A session later today. Also, for the planners in the audience, viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Smart Growth America's Equity Summit, or you can use the event number 9211392. With that, we're going to do another poll here before we introduce the panel. We'd love to know what sort of books today's group is most likely to have read. So you can see now on your screen that there are 5 that you can select, and you can select all of them that you've read. And I know I've read, I think, all of these myself. So again, if you're having some issue with responding, you need to may need to leave the full screen mode, and we'll leave this open for maybe another 20-30 seconds so that people get a chance to respond. And thanks everybody who is. We can see the responses coming in. Now you can see the response. 63% of those who responded have read The Color of Law, 38% Suburban Nation, 24% Caste, 15% Right of Way, and 10% of Know Your Price by our panelist today, Dr. Andre Perry. So thanks for participating in that. So joining Calvin on the panel today are Andre Perry, a fellow at Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program, a scholar in residence at American University, and author of Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. We are happy to have Andre back with us today. Secondly, Council Member Kenyon McDuffie of the District of Columbia, who's a council member for Ward 5, who was first elected to the Council of the District of Columbia in a 2012 special election, and was re-elected to full 4-year terms in 2014 and again in 2018. Since 2013, he has served as the chairman pro tem of the council. Finally, Jasmine Thomas, who is the senior vice president for U.S. business partnerships within community investing and development at Citi. Jasmine leads corporate and national engagement supporting solutions and initiatives designed to close the racial wealth gap, including Citi's action for racial equity. And with that, we're going to have one final poll here before we begin, kind of asking about opportunity zones, which are an important factor that affect capital investment. So we'd like to get a rough sense of how today's participants and what they know about opportunity zones. So how familiar are you with them? And again, you have 3 choices here. Yes, you can explain it in a few sentences. Secondly, I've heard of them, but they are crazy hard to understand. That may be me. And 3, what are opportunity zones? And again, we'll leave this open for a couple of seconds for folks to respond. And it looks like about a third of you have, so thank you again. We'll just leave this open for another second or two and then show the responses. And in this case, 47% have heard of them, but they're crazy hard to understand. 39% of the audience can explain them in a few sentences. And for 14%, this will be some new material to go over. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our opening speaker today, Chris Zimmerman. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Michael. And on behalf of all my colleagues at Smart Growth America, I'd like to welcome you to day 2 of Smart Growth America's Equity Summit. Yesterday, we heard Dr. Andre Perry discuss how structural racism in our land use, infrastructure, and economic development policies has systematically devalued Black people in our country. His findings, which you can read more of in his book, Know Your Price, and I see that 90% of you have yet to read that book, so you'll want to do that. One of the findings he showed was that $156 billion in cumulative losses result for the Black community from housing disparities. I think the most important thing, though, to me, the thing that really struck me was the statement, equity is stimulus. If you want to grow the economy, if you want to improve conditions, build equity. I think this message is a good summary of the SGA approach to economic development. We try to center equitable outcomes in our work, helping communities build shared prosperity. Our recent report, Unrealized Gains, is a good example, and you'll hear more about that in today's program. I'm an economist who got into politics. I served for years in local government before coming to SGA. My tenure as a local elected official coincided with the emergence of the movements for smart growth and sustainable development. Perhaps because of that background, I've always been struck by how so many of the values that we care about, the environment, health, social justice, and racial equity, are often pitted against economic performance. In the relative successes of the environmental movement generally, and smart growth in particular, one of the things that had to be overcome was the idea that the goals of environmental protection were fundamentally in conflict with economic growth and prosperity, that there's necessarily a price to be paid for reducing pollution and saving our natural environment. The reality, as has been well demonstrated, is that environmental destruction is ultimately incompatible with economic success. That's true both on a very micro level, a local level, site contamination, for instance, preventing development, and on a global level, flooding from climate change, devastating economic assets, and so on. Similarly, in the past year, we've heard many arguments, including from some leaders, that would pit public health goals against the economy, as if we have to choose between fighting the pandemic and having jobs, when in fact, defeating the virus is essential to preserving the economy. I think similarly, there is a tendency to view the fight for social justice and racial equality as a conflict between a moral imperative and hard economic reality. The moral case is so strong and compelling that even advocates may tend to yield to the notion that economic sacrifice is a necessary cost of correcting systemic social injustices. But as with the environment and health, the truth is that the maintenance of inequality, the continued legacy of generations of racial discrimination, has a negative impact on the economy, both on a micro and macro level. It's not only wrong, it comes with a price tag. I observed this very directly through my service in local government. My community was economically successful, not in spite of, but because of our commitment to diversity. The efforts we made in a variety of areas, affordable housing, small business, inclusion policies, welcoming immigrants, celebrating our historic role in fighting massive resistance and as the place that first integrated public schools in Virginia, besides being just the right thing to do, were factors in our ability to attract, retain, and grow business, create jobs, and so on. It was very clear to me that equity in our highly diverse community was of vital importance, not only because it is a moral imperative, which it is, but as a strategic factor for the overall success and prosperity of our community. There are lots of different examples, some of them small, but they all add up in very different ways. What attracts employers these days is workforce. What attracts much of the talented workforce they want to get is the diversity of the community. It takes lots of people doing a lot of different things to make a complex local economy function properly. So you need to have a place to be able to accommodate people of all different kinds, of all different income levels. We did a study and we saw how the development of a mixed-use office building generates demand for affordable housing. We heard from the leadership of, for instance, our hospital on the challenges of maintaining a stable workforce when you had difficulty for people of lower income to have a place to live. Corporate decisions about where to locate were clearly being made, as we heard directly, based on the value to their employees of having a rich diversity and a rich variety of businesses to attend, not only restaurants, but yes, restaurants too, close to where they worked. Not just national chains, which they could get anywhere, but the locally owned and operated places that provide all that authenticity so sought after. But that authenticity depends a lot on a lot of small, locally owned, legacy, minority-owned businesses, which face many obstacles. So equity is a moral imperative. That's enough reason to pursue it. But in making the case, it's important to understand and for us to explain the economic case that the pursuit of justice is also a path to prosperity. Again, in Dr. Perry's words, equity is stimulus. If you want to grow the economy, if you want to improve conditions, build equity. Anti-racism is a good economic strategy, but Black and brown businesses face very large obstacles, even when we're not in a pandemic, that inhibit their ability to contribute to the success of our communities and of our nation. We have to have policy tools at the local level, the state level, the federal level, aligned with the work that must be done. To me, that's a lot of what the summit is about, especially today's program. And to kick us off in that discussion, no better person than the president of Smart Growth America, Calvin Gladley. And I'd like to turn this over now to Calvin.
Hello again, everyone. And thank you, Chris Z. Thank you, Chris Z, for those great remarks, both the personal connection that you made, as well as referencing all of our work on small businesses. You know, it's really interesting, and it's glad to see so many people showed up for today's event, because many would say, well, why are we talking about Black and brown businesses in the context of smart growth and planning and the like? So I wanted to do a couple of opening remarks before we got to our panel, just to talk to you quickly about why you should care, why it's important and is a key to smart growth, and all of the things that Chris Zimmerman talked about, and what we're going to do going forward. So I'm just going to start there. So I always like to say smart growth is smart business, partially because, as Chris Zimmerman talked about earlier, we just did a report about this in October, where we drilled into opportunity zones. And I know some of you, 14% of you said, huh, opportunity zones? And some of you were like, I don't quite get it. And we understand, and we have the resources for you. Not only, if you go to the link that you see there, not only do we have this report, Unrealized Gains, as Chris Zimmerman talked about, specifically about Black and brown legacy businesses and small businesses and whether they're accessing opportunity zone capital. We also have our opportunity zones ranking report, which actually does give you a kind of 101 sense of opportunity zones. But what's also interesting is, even though this report came out in October 2020, we're not new to talking about business in the context of smart growth. I know you can't see quite the date on this report, but it says 2004. So we've been talking about business and why focusing on business is a key to smart growth for decades. And so just wanted to ground you that this is important, and it's always been important, and we're going to lift that discussion back up going forward for our movement. So, but wanted to give you kind of 3 specific examples, and ours, obviously our panelists, our great panelists will get into this more, but wanted to quickly give you 3 specific examples why supporting Black and brown businesses actually helps achieve smart growth. You heard a lot of examples of why from Chris Zimmerman, and I just wanted to give you a couple with some visuals. So we can talk about placemaking, we'll talk about equity, and we'll talk about economics. So all of our work, and I said a little bit about this yesterday, really tries to create the type of vibrant and authentic place that is the sort of hallmark of a successful smart growth place. Another hallmark is that it's actually equitable. So you could see this visual here. This is a Black-owned restaurant in St. Petersburg, Florida. And for all of you from Louisiana, you're saying, well, this is a Creole cafe, but you said it's in St. Petersburg, Florida. Well, the two Black owners of this cafe are originally from Louisiana, and they have that background. So we just want to do the things that support bringing authenticity, not just of authenticity of place, but authenticity of the business owners that actually create part of the vibrancy and the originality of that place. And that's one of the reasons why supporting Black and brown businesses does that. Secondly, supporting the businesses, we always talk about smart growth and the environment we're trying to build, and we say unique, and we specifically say a mix of uses, commercial, residential, retail. But sometimes we sort of leave out the retail, we leave out the small businesses as something we need to specifically support. And it's important, and you can see this visual in Washington, D.C., the Adams Morgan neighborhood. Partially the vibrancy and the uniqueness comes from the small businesses that we put in there. So as planners and placemakers, we can't allow the businesses and the support of them just to be someone else's job. We have to figure out where we can play a role. Third, you've probably often heard me say, if it's not equitable, it's not smart growth. There's no such thing as equitable smart growth because you don't need that adjective to modify that noun. And so you can see this picture of a Washington landmark called Ben's Chili Bowl. And it's a real example of how having smart growth places with equitability as a goal is super important. And one reason it's important is if you want to get that uniqueness and that authenticity, you have to make sure you have some anti-displacement strategies in place. And part of that anti-displacement has to apply not just to residential, but also to the businesses and keeping the Ben's Chili Bowl. The other thing I want to say is the idea of cultural displacement. Oftentimes, it's not just the fact that residents get displaced in some cases, it's not just the fact that businesses, but when businesses in particular get displaced, that's often where you lose the culture. You lose the sort of special tissue of the place, and Ben's Chili Bowl is an example of that. So you really can help to promote equity by making sure that we support Black and brown businesses. And as planners and placemakers and elected officials and city leaders, we have to lift up businesses in order to get to that result. Finally, economics, and Chris Zimmerman talked a little bit about this. I personally took this picture at Ben's Chili Bowl, and it really just reflects the hiring of Black and brown community members when you have Black and brown business owners. So to the extent you want to focus on equity and equitable outcomes, when you support Black and brown businesses, you're also supporting that cycling of jobs in that same community. You're also supporting, and I'm channeling something in Andre Price's book, Andre Perry's book, Know the Price, when it's like buy back the block. And if you see this picture where it says next door, Ben's Chili Bowl, the owners, they actually bought that building next door. So there's a wealth building aspect to supporting Black and brown businesses that not only benefits the owners of that business, but also the larger community. It's a revitalization strategy. That building was empty. They made it nicer. They made the corridor more vibrant. And so you really think it's good economics to support Black and brown businesses. And finally, and Chris Z talked about this, and Andre Perry may do it a little bit more, as Andre said, equity is stimulus. You can definitively look at these visuals and understand the economic ramifications on jobs, gross domestic product, and the wealth gap on supporting Black and brown businesses. And we need to do that more because 28% of our population in the United States are Black and brown people, but only 8% of our businesses are. So we really need to do something, and what the numbers show is if we can close this percentage gap, so more Black and brown businesses are created to align with the numbers, better align with the numbers in the population, you really can have a great effect on economics. And we all know in closing that COVID-19 has had a disproportionate effect, not just on Black and brown people and communities, but on the businesses that support them. So this really is a moment. And as I said yesterday, now is our time to step up, not just for communities, but for Black and brown businesses as folks who want to support and create smarter growth. It's something that we can do. So I have the honor and privilege to have just an awesome panel. And I want to bring that panel to bear to this conversation. We're going to start off where each of them just does a little introduction of themselves and kind of contextualize their background and their work and why they care about this issue. I'm going to then ask them a series of questions to kind of gin up some debate and conversation. Then we're going to actually have them ask themselves some questions. They'll talk to each other and ask themselves some questions. And then you, the audience, continually gin up your questions, and we'll ask some of your questions as well. I know that we've had lots of people. I mean, right now we have over 1,200 people on this webinar, so we're unlikely to get to all of your questions, but ask all of the ones you can ask, and some of them we'll send along in the future, but we'll try to get as many questions in as we can from you, the audience. So thank you, and let's dive right into the panel. And first up will be Andre for his kind of introductory remarks.
Yes, thank you, Calvin. And I also want to thank all of you for joining us today. My name is Andre Perry, as was mentioned. I'm the author of the book, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where I study Black majority cities. There are about 1,200 of them across the country. I study them large and small. But I look at the assets in them. I look to see their value, and I look at how racism extracts value from those assets. So I'm looking forward to this conversation because I know the panelists work fairly well. So I'm really looking forward to this vibrant conversation.
Thank you, Andre. Next up, Councilmember McDuffie.
Thank you. Hello to everyone. I want to thank Smart Growth America for hosting this very important summit today, and Calvin Gladney for leading this important conversation. I'm especially pleased to be on the panel with Dr. Andre Perry and Jasmine Thomas. As was mentioned, my name is Kenyon McDuffie. I'm a council member in DC representing Ward 5. I'm also the council's chair pro tempore and the chair of the Committee on Business and Economic Development. And I've been on the council for 12 years. But I've been in the city of the District of Columbia my entire life. And growing up here in DC, I really have encountered far too many Black people who simply couldn't imagine a better future for themselves and their families. And so I really view my work at the council through the prism of my upbringing. And I've been really driven by my desire to change that reality for people today and expand economic opportunities for Black residents in the nation's capital who have historically been denied such opportunities. I think we all know that the deep racial disparities exist across the country. We talked about COVID-19 a little earlier. I think the pandemic relief has stretched far and thin. There's disparities in healthcare, housing, economic opportunities, education, criminal justice. It really permeates every aspect of society. And so I think these issues aren't new. In many ways, though, we're seeing them get worse. And so, I think Black-owned businesses really make up less than 14% of all businesses in the District of Columbia, and they have an average annual revenue of less than 15% of the white businesses here. And even though Black businesses and Black individuals, I should say, make up 45% of our city's population. We still see Black entrepreneurs struggle to access capital, navigate the regulatory process, and operate profitable businesses. And so I'm really excited about this conversation that we're going to have today. With all these challenges ahead of us to tackle, I'm really glad to be here and be a part of this board discussion.
Thank you, council member. And next up, and I just want to say a special thing because Jasmine's one of my favorite people. How many times did you get to hear a working banking professional at a placemaking, planning, smart growth event? So this is a special moment. So, take good notes because Jasmine is going to bring the ruckus. Jasmine?
I don't know about ruckus, but I'm so grateful to be on this panel with all of you. You know, I'm excited. I also want to plug Andre's book. I actually picked it up months ago, and it's been critical, and I'm just been grateful to see how my career has come a bit full circle. And so, Calvin, it's not too new. I'm so grateful because early in my career, I interned for Governor Glendenning.
Yep.
So you can tell it's over 20 years ago. And so smart growth was, you know, when I was in college, the first thing that I heard in my first formal internship, and the importance of preserving communities and what that means from an environmental and a community justice standpoint. And so a lot of what I want to talk about today is, you know, just how much of a privilege it is, Calvin, as you said, the ways in which we have an opportunity to partner with community from a private sector lens, and from a large financial institution like Citi, that is very diverse, very global, and very, you know, urban. And what does it mean to bring to bear this conversation on racial equity and put it at the center of our business strategy?
Right.
You know, yesterday, I'm sure you can imagine, I had my little tears down my little cheek in my own home here in Hollis, Queens, because I still live in the neighborhood.
Hey.
Just exactly. Just hearing the White House report some economist data, and to know that it is our data at Citigroup. The fact
Oh,
that
wow.
we know from our GPS report and closing the racial inequity gaps that $16 trillion could have been added 20 years ago. So I'm just so proud of the courage and the leadership of our economists, our global economists, to produce an independent report that already builds on what we know in making that equity case. It builds on and complements the work that Andre's been doing, and others like PolicyLink and their National Equity Atlas. Just further underscores the importance of equity as an economic driver and no longer just a moral case. And so a wonderful opportunity to hear that yesterday. But then as we look at the opportunity for us is, you know, we didn't want to go it alone. We knew we weren't going to go it alone, but really leading from our business strategies where we have strong relationships, where we can bring local Black and minority-owned banks to the table, bringing them into the capital markets, bringing in more consumers into home ownership. Your data yesterday, Andre's language around, equity being a stimulus. We know it's true. So the question is, what does it take for us to really speak each other's language, learn how to speak each other's language, bring in increased capital for communities, but also demonstrate the leadership we know that's required to become more and more anti-racist. That wasn't a book on your list, but I would add that book. And something that I think as we think about community development and planning, I know you've got it in your stack. It's something that it behooves all of us to try to figure out what it takes to actually move into that space. And I'm looking forward to and so excited about the leadership at Citi and the work that our CFO, incoming CEO Jane Fraser, and our outgoing CEO Mike Corbat have done to really put Citi front and center in this conversation.
Now, I told you guys that I would ad-lib some questions, and part of the reason why we wanted to do this summit is because we wanted to sort of talk among ourselves and basically talk among what is now is 1,250 of our closest friends. And part of the challenge is this is a hard conversation. So I want to start with a question that I really want you to dig in on, which is, we're specifying here that to get to these equitable outcomes and then get the both moral imperatives outcomes, to get the economic benefits and all the other benefits we've described, we don't just say, let's support small businesses. We say we need to support Black and brown businesses. So we're calling out race and ethnicity as a core part of what we need to do. And so my question for each of you is, and I'll start with you, Jasmine, because you just mentioned it, why the specificity on race and not just small businesses in general? And what is the benefit of doing it that way?
Mm-hmm. Well, when we launched a little over $1 billion in commitment to close the racial wealth gap, looking at those sectors around housing, looking at consumer access, looking at credit building, investments in minority banks, we knew that we had to call out the fact that race is a lens that is clear. We can't get away from it. And quite frankly, we saw the data of the underinvestment and thought that it was important for us to really be strategic and targeted in our approach. And so, you know, many people say, oh, well, a lot of corporations made announcements. Absolutely. And in fact, you know, many of us will continue to do this kind of work. But if you look back even 10 years ago, we had already started to hear from nonprofits and communities across the country how neighborhoods were changing. The storefronts that were emptying rather quickly, even after when everyone else said there was a boom, those neighborhoods looked very different. And they lost a lot of the texture and a lot of the cultural kind of districts. We also had nonprofits call us about some of the kind of housing waivers that changed and made neighborhoods and commercial space more expensive. And so I'd say in 2014, 2015, we saw a few things that we could do. One is really look at employee ownership and business succession as a strategy, specifically in those Black and brown businesses. I remember an article that Earl Graves wrote at the cover of Black Enterprise one month, where he talked about a friend of his who died and didn't have a succession strategy. And all of his kids had left. They left the neighborhood. They no longer were running the business. And so when we looked at how we could invest in small businesses, we thought, what direct way could we do that? And that's employee ownership. How do you help Black and brown people who run the business every day become an owner in that community, become an owner? And what are the financing structures that are needed? How do we ensure that policy is aligned with that initiative? And so we worked with groups like the Asset Building Policy Network and NowCab and PolicyLink and National Council, Unidos US and others, and National Capacity, the AAPI focus group, to say, how do we bring to bear the cultural diversity that neighborhoods need and make that business case of how the connection between housing affordability and commercial affordability really is tied together, and what kind of support is needed. So calling out race was critical for us not just because we saw it before, we were close to community, but also because the data and the research and the numbers just showed the kind of opportunity that was for us. And we wanted to make sure that we were able to really bring the full weight of not just our community investments, but our corporate and our business investments as well.
Awesome. I'm going to ask you guys the same question, but I'm going to actually make it harder, just for fun. Council member and then Andre, when you address this question of why specifically Black and brown businesses and focusing on race and ethnicity, also share with the audience how you navigate that as a Black person who is a leader, because you can't make those comments in the same way, or they may be received in a different way. And what are your tools that you use when knowing you're not just saying this as a leader, but you're saying this as a Black leader, as a minority leader, and how does that affect what you do and how you do it?
Sure, no, that's a great question, and I appreciate Jasmine's response. I got to tell you, in the District of Columbia, you know, we have really stark racial disparities that exist, and not unlike many other cities across the United States. But if you don't call out race, and you don't, you know, to the extent you have to make people uncomfortable, then you may as well be talking about equality and simply doing the same thing that governments have been doing for decades, where, you know, it's a push to increase resources across the board. And that's not what equity is. Equity is giving people specifically what they need to thrive in an environment. And in the District of Columbia, when we talk about Black businesses, we know historically they're the businesses that have faced greater barriers to starting and sustaining businesses. We know that the communities where those Black businesses are, they're hiring, you know, Black individuals from those communities. We know that those Black businesses, in many cases, are the legacy businesses that have helped to build those communities and sustain those communities through some of the toughest times that we've seen in our nation's capital. We also know that when they have the supports that they need, when they have the capital to invest, those Black businesses are also the way that families have built wealth over the years. And so there's so many reasons that we need to call out race, because when we talk about, you know, every indicator of success, be it education, graduation rates, be it, you know, income, wealth, health, housing, criminal justice, the common thread that weaves itself through all those things in the District of Columbia is race. Black people are on the bottom of that socioeconomic totem pole. And so that's why we have to call out race. And frankly, you know, while it might be difficult early on, what I found is that people who are reasonable will recognize the disparities that exist. In the District of Columbia, we have, you know, one of the widest racial wealth gaps in the entire country. We have one of the most segregated housing markets in the entire country based on race. The median white family in the District of Columbia, Calvin, has a net worth of 81 times that of the median Black family. We're talking about $284,000 versus $3,500. You got to call that out for what it is if we expect to be able to move the needle and start to be intentional about how you dedicate resources in a way that builds up those communities that need it the most.
Right. That's awesome. And let me tell you, I know this is virtual, but people are definitely doing finger snaps in the audience to that comment. Dr. Perry.
Yeah, you know, when I address my colleagues, friends, and even folks who don't agree with me, I always tell them that nothing grows without investment. I don't care who you are. And if you look at the growth of white businesses, is it because they were invested in? And if you look at the reason why Black growth is not occurring at the rate that it should, it's because we were systematically denied of those investments. Remember, most people start their businesses using the equity in their homes. So things like redlining, racial housing covenants, lending discrimination in housing impacts your ability to start a business.
Yep.
In addition, I tell particularly my white brothers and sisters to put things in perspective. After a few weeks of being socially distanced, you heard business leaders screaming for relief. But try being socially distanced for generations. What does that relief look like? And then finally, there's another aspect to this. I study underappreciated assets, meaning if you just add water, it will grow. You know, Black businesses are, and according to my research, and I just tweeted out a series of tweets, one of which is the devaluation of businesses in Black communities, and I'm using the hashtag Smart Growth Equity, so look for those tweets. But one of the studies in there is about the devaluation of businesses. We scraped Yelp data from all businesses across the country, looking at businesses in Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. And what we found is that Black, brown, and Asian businesses actually score higher on Yelp than their white counterparts. But as the neighborhoods become Blacker, they get less reviews and less revenue. But in all cases, the Black, brown, and Asian businesses are ranked higher. Now, what does that mean? You know, I said this yesterday. There was an old adage the elders used to use: our ice is just as cold, right? Because they knew that if you bypass quality, you distort the market in a way that forces high quality businesses to compete with low quality businesses. You reduce revenue, and also you reduce talent. If you're not going to get food from that Jamaican spot in the hood, you're missing out. So a situation, you're cutting your nose to spite your face when you don't want to see Black and brown and Asian businesses grow. Now, and there's one more thing. I just always got to point this out. The reason why we didn't get investment is because of anti-Black legislation. It was anti-Black legislation that put us here. Now, a lot of people are affected by that, particularly our brown brothers and sisters. They too are affected by anti-Black legislation. We all are. So, but the reason why we have to be very specific, because the source of the problem is race-based. And we try all these workarounds, but there is no workaround. They denied they meaning white male leadership,
Mm.
and people, policymakers denied Black people housing subsidies, business subsidies. Just a few months ago, we saw a PPP loan program roll out without acknowledging the racial history behind Blacks' relationships with banks. And so for me, this is just about addressing the problem. And this, and not to go off, but we talk so much about rugged individualism and pulling your boots off, but too many times when we talk about that and when we talk about race, people cringe. Oh, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. That's too much. You're divisive. What happened to that rugged individualism?
Right.
Face some facts.
You just.
Well, can I add to that, Calvin?
Yeah, if he had a mic, he would have dropped it right now. Jasmine, why don't you add? And I'm going to pick up the legislative.
So just really quickly. So Andre's right, or say Dr. Perry's right. A part of this is also we're not talking about is how are we investing in innovation in our communities?
Yeah.
And so so if you look at who's getting funding from VC investors or other types of Silicon Valley funds, it's nil, almost nil Black and brown firms.
Is nil a technical term, by the way?
Nil is a technical term. It's a technical term. It's laughable. So there's so many things that we need to be doing differently. And so for us, it was absolutely our business leaders saying we need to have specific carve outs and say we're investing in Black founders. Period. Stop. We're not moving forward. At least $50 million. At least it's a floor. It's not the ceiling, but it at least says to us and to the world, we are acknowledging this disparity, and we believe that innovation comes from those who are invested in and who are partnered with. And I also want to add another thing. We think about communities, it's always how is the big institution coming in to take over? I'm so proud of the legacy in my family of bringing in institutions that we wanted in our communities, inviting them in and then setting the table and saying, this is how you will invest. So my grandmother was one of the first in our community in Hollis to set up a community benefits agreement, bringing in a formal, institution like a pharmacy in 1978. And in fact, I think this is the 40th anniversary of when she first called a major pharmacy to say, do you care about Black and brown communities? If so, I'd love for you to come to Hollis, see what's going on, brought in Mayor Koch and signed an agreement. And that money is still reinvesting into that same plaza that I can see on Francis Rose Boulevard.
Koch reference. So I'm just going to leave that there for the audience to Google.
Exactly. And so these things are important, but this is where partnering with minority banks are key. 60% of mortgages come from them. People feel good about walking into their local bank. They know the managers, they know folks. So at the end of the day, this is about not taking over, but how do we bring more folks who are critical to the economic system and to the infrastructure of our communities and really bringing them to a table in a way where they can be accretive and we can be accretive to them.
You made me go to my bookshelf again. Well, one, if you want to, another book recommendation is this book, The Color of Money. Mercer Barada. Yes, that. What you said. We can put it in the chat. That's a book. It's a must read. I found it very illuminating. I know the council member has read it as well. And then it was in our chat, but The Color of Law. And this is a segue to my next question. Both Andre and the council member mentioned the idea that we have to talk about race and we have to specifically talk about a history of anti-Black legislative policy. And so which means that we have to have affirmatively Black and brown or policies that affirmatively support Black and brown businesses in those communities, because otherwise you can't go from decades of policies that were specifically anti-Black and then say, well, now we're just neutral. We're starting from scratch and let's just do, as the council member said, policies that benefit everybody and that Black and brown businesses will catch up and those communities will catch up. It's not true. So I wanted to ask you, council member, and then Andre, what are you, for the folks in the audience who are advocates, who are actually elected officials, and I know we have some today, what is your recommendation for the type of legislative policy you need to support Black and brown businesses to achieve these placemaking and equitable goals? And what are some of the best practices you found to sort of overcome the challenges?
Well, thank you for that question, Andre. I got to tell you, for me, what I found is that you've got to be bold and you've got to have the political will. I think far too many local governments have sought to address these issues by investing more into the same exact programs. And the programs are doing very little to lift people up out of poverty and give them the sorts of economic mobility that we know that they want and that will help to push them into the middle class. And so I think we've got to start by acknowledging that the best resource advocacy groups, in my experience, really aren't lobbying for racial equity or greater investment in Black-owned businesses. They may be talking about affordable housing. They may be talking about homelessness. They may be talking about issues that matter. They're all important issues. But when you start talking about the path to prosperity, and I don't hear as many people contacting my office to talk about supporting Black-owned banks. And so despite the lack of organized advocacy around these issues, I know what the data say. And so, I've been pushing these bold, comprehensive legislative changes to try to achieve racial equity in the District of Columbia. And I've gotten some success. And so recently—
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I authored in January of 2019, I authored a bill that I call the Racial Equity Achieved Results Act. And it took over 2 years to get the bill passed. Wow. But I fought to ensure that it was funded last year in the budget. And the Council of the District of Columbia, my colleagues, passed it unanimously. And we just launched the Council's Office on Racial Equity, which is going to provide racial equity impact assessments, right? So every time a bill comes before the Council, there are going to be a tool that measures the impact on race and whether we are actually moving the needle to close racial disparities in the nation's capital, much like we have in place already fiscal impact statements that measure the fiscal impact and the legal sufficiency statements that measure whether or not the bill is legal. We want to know what the impact is going to be on race. And so I think it's a very important first step. But to be candid, the reality is that we need the executive branch of government to take similar steps. And there's some requirements to ensure that the executive is also establishing an Office of Racial Equity and is using data and metrics to measure whether the agency's work is actually moving the needle on closing racial disparities. I think that is key because I think many times we know that governments measure their success by how much more funding they put into an existing program, when in fact programs do very little to cut down on these disparities that have existed for decades.
Man, my colleague Beth Osborne is going to have a panel tomorrow on transportation that's going to talk about that, which is let's just keep putting more money at it, but not actually solve this particular problem. So we'll hear more about that tomorrow as well.
Really quickly, Calvin, to borrow Dr. Perry's words, what I talked about earlier about making sure it's targeted and it's intentional in the communities that need it most, it's because if we don't target it, if we simply put across the board improvements and increases, then you're going to have communities that are wealthy and well-resourced getting benefits that they don't necessarily need. In many cases, they don't ask for, right? And Andre Perry has said, accounting for historical discrimination doesn't throttle white people's economic mobility, right? Becoming more inclusive increases the size of the proverbial pie. And we need governments to be intentional in becoming more inclusive when they do their economic development policies and programs so that we are benefiting those communities that historically have been discriminated against.
Absolutely. Jasmine and Andre, anything to add to that?
Let me tell you, I really don't have anything to add, but to add accolades, because, again, I study underappreciated assets. Another asset that we do not recognize is leadership. You absolutely need leadership for growth. Council Member Duffy is providing the roadmap for many cities and for the country, actually. You know, another article I put in the chat under this smart growth equity hashtag was also a recommendation to create a plurality scoring system. The same way, as council member said, that the same way we score bills and their impacts on the budget, we should be scoring bills on the impact on equity. But you don't really get there if you have leadership that cannot or won't address the problem. You know, there's a, you know, I want to talk just about a little bit about leadership here, you know, because it is in short supply. You know, if we don't have leaders at, I don't care if it's on the school board, city council, mayors, governors, presidents, if we don't have leadership who will look at the problem squarely in the eye and say, we have to deal with the race, we're never going to get over this. You know, one of the problems I have, while I certainly love the fact that the President of the United States has introduced equity into the conversation, introduced that value, because, and I've been saying this, a lot of people have been saying it, Biden has said equity more than any president ever, and has only been in a month in office. And that includes your first Black president. You know, he's saying it in policy, and that's important. But he's defining equity as fairness, right? There's another component to equity, and it's around fiscal issues. The wealth that has been extracted by racism must be restored. Even if Black people saved up every cent of their discretionary income, the racial wealth gap won't close for hundreds of years.
258 years.
There you go. Jasmine has the data, right? City has the data.
You got to pay for it.
That's right. So you need stimulus. You need resources. You don't have equity just with fairness. You also have it with resources. And so one of the reasons why I love these banks and others, because Jasmine's bringing information, she also bringing resources. You need to bring some resources to the table. But the point is that we won't get over this hump without investment. And so I also know and believe that this window of opportunity we have is going to close, where corporations, particularly banks, financial institutions in general, are contributing billions of dollars. And you know, we can argue how much is it hurting them. I don't really think it is, but they are investing. We need the federal government to follow up, because the window's going to close. Is the federal government going to respond and get their back in that investment? And so Council Member Duffy, the programs he's doing in DC should be scaled up. It should be brought into other cities. We have an opportunity to spotlight Council Member Duffy, to say, what is he doing in DC? We need to do it in Minneapolis. We need to do it in Pittsburgh. We need to do it in Cleveland. And so we have this opportunity. So I want to just push on that leadership piece. Because
I know we have hundreds, we have questions on top of questions on top of questions coming from the audience right now. But I wanted to move us to one more point, if I may. And Jasmine, I'm actually going to bring you in. I love this thread about leadership. And so my question is, in this current window of opportunity, the leaders come from all sectors. So it's nonprofit sector, public sector, elected officials like Councilmember McDuffie, and even the academic sector, to the extent we align you in Brookings there, Andre. So my question is, and I'll start with you, Jasmine, what's the best way to use public-private partnerships to do this work, because it's easier said than done when you just have one leader in one sector who actually has a goal and then said, this is what we're going to do. But when you have a multi-sector interdisciplinary problem, which requires multidisciplinary and intersector solutions, what's the best practices and your ideas there? Jasmine first, and then council member, I know you've dealt with this as well.
What's great is I get to go after Andre, because I do have some points around leadership. I would also add there's not one problem. And I think we're intentionally in a situation because we've only seen it with one lens. And in fact, I think a part of what's critical now is something that we've been talking about internally a lot is what lens are we bringing to this work? And to be honest, it's approaching it with humility. Realizing that we don't have all the answers. We're going to get started with commitments. Andre's point is well taken. I'm hoping it's not a flash in the pan moment, because a number of us have invested over years of commitments that must be done. For us, we started with a few and we're going to continue. I'm working on it now. And so I think a part of this is humility, intentionality. So when you think about public-private partnerships, I'm going to try to weave your question into this as well, because I think it's key. We talked earlier about being specific about race. That's very intentional in an approach. The other thing is, who are we bringing to the table? Who's allowed to contribute? How are we creating spaces, and how are we communicating across sectors? And one of the things that I'm particularly appreciative about is that in the 10, 15 years I've been working in this space, regardless of the institution, this notion of constant dialogue across sectors, but also accountability. So it's not just the metrics, but it's also how are we making sure that we're keeping each other accountable to the things that we say we want in communities and how we invest in communities. And I think that takes a second, because it can't be a siloed conversation or a sidecar deal. It's got to be embedded in your process and approach. And so when we talk about, what it means to constantly strive to be an anti-racist institution, it means how do we embed policies and practices that are critical to how we need to operate, really modeling a lens of inclusion in a way that we, perhaps as a field of finance, and I'm going to be clear, field and finance has never really thought about it in that intentional way. And so a part of that is making sure that we build the infrastructure and the metrics and the kind of the things that we need, the benchmarks around it, so that we all know how we're getting there. A part of what I said earlier is that I come to this work not just because someone said racial equity is the conversation for today, come up with something, and you work with these people to get it done. It's because building a lens over years. And talking to different groups of people is key. And so when you think about the development space, I remember few advocacy groups who spent a ton of time with developers or urban planners or policy folks. The fact that the council member said, he doesn't get a lot of those calls about being specific, that actually makes me nervous. I grew up in Baltimore, so not quite DC. My time in DC was deciding when I would not go to school to go to Howard's homecoming and hang out with famous people. That was my interaction with DC as a kid in the 80s and 90s. But that's a problem. It can't be that you don't hear from who's in those communities telling you what they think. And so a part of that is building that relationship. And Andre said leadership before. It's perfect, because in my thoughts, I had leadership as critical to public-private partnerships as well, and grateful for the work that we've been doing with Treasury to really mentor protege with MDIs, so that we bring them into Treasury in a partnership and strategies, and building them into the pipeline as partners in ways that haven't ever before, and really have grown in that space. And again, investing in the data, investing in the organizations who have the ability to be that kind of bellwether and accountability partner for you. Andre talked about more cities needing to do what DC did. What's great is I talked to the Chicago head of equity a couple of weeks ago. Great to know that 5 years ago, I was harassing probably Calvin and some other folks to let's start talking about embedding equity into city government, into government structures, into how we look at policy, and to know that cities are starting that. In Long Island has a chief equity officer in Suffolk County, someone who came from the community, made their point at an event and in legislative hearings to testify why the racial wealth gap was a problem, and then is appointed as the first chief equity officer for Suffolk County. So again, these are places where race and conversation is painful, but as we start to show how the data and leadership and accountability and metrics and intentionality come together, that's when you start to see the magic that is critical to unlocking where we are now.
Just for purposes of the audience, there's lots of examples of this building actually into government infrastructure, racial equity officers. Another example is my good buddy, Majestic Lane. Not sure if Majestic, you're on the webinar here, out of the great city of Pittsburgh. And one of my favorite mayors, Mayor Peduto, created a new office of equity and appointed Majestic the chief equity officer essentially for the city. And there's other examples on the West Coast as well. So this is something, it's both intersectoral, but it's also within the levers of government. You need a Council McDuffie on the legislative side, but you actually need to follow through on the administrative bureaucratic side with also someone on sort of a whole of government basis, because you can't have the council member creating great legislation, but then it still goes back to the mayor and other folks that work for the government to actually execute and implement. So you need that kind of intergovernmental partnership as well. Council member?
No, I appreciate that. Public-private partnerships are absolutely essential. And I'll tell you, I'm not doing this stuff on my own. Obviously, there are people who are advocating for some of these things, but I've also took the time to establish working groups to help advise my work. And so 3 years ago, even before I introduced the REACH Act, I formed a cross-sector working group on racial equity that included people from the private sector, philanthropic sector, nonprofits, and ordinary residents as well, because I wanted that buy-in and the insights from all of these folks to help inform the work that we're doing in government, because government can't get these things done alone. And so that's important. There's some other things that we're doing that I've seen that have been extraordinarily important in terms of public-private partnerships playing an essential role to supporting Black and brown businesses. What I did during the pandemic was establish a Equitable Recovery Working Group, and Dr. Perry was kind enough to be a member of that working group. And we, as a result of their advice and our work, I introduced a series of measures that got incorporated into the budget for fiscal year 2021. And those priorities included a new designation for equity impact enterprises, right? It's a business designation that includes locally based small businesses that are owned by minorities and women and others facing disadvantage. I worked with the mayor as well recently and asked her to roll out a series of new requests for proposals, or RFPs, for district development projects in the city, utilizing this new priority designation, so that when real estate that is district owned is being developed, it isn't being developed simply by the folks who have the most resources. In many cases, white men who typically have the resources in this area. And so this kind of intentional step towards economic inclusion, we really need more of in governments across the country. The DC Anchor Project, which is being done by the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development in DC, I've worked closely with Steve Blaudet and provided funding over the years. Well, last year, I got $250,000 and put it in a recurring way, which means all the government wants, it means year after year after year it will be there, rather than having to try to find Rob Peter to pay Paul to do this. Right. And so they're partnering with Citi and Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, to be able to connect Black-owned businesses and contractors to anchor institutions in the District of Columbia, places like hospitals and colleges and universities, and their procurement dollars to be intentional about engaging Black-owned businesses. And so I'm supporting that. I'm amplifying the work that they're doing. I put $1 million in the budget for the District of Columbia's. We only have 2 chartered banks here in DC, and only one of them is Black-owned. And so I put $1 million to support Industrial Bank, given the unique role that they play in supporting Black residents and Black businesses in our nation's capital. I put $750,000 to do a disparity study. In DC, we don't have a minority business enterprise program. We have a broader, more watered down.
Shock people.
Yeah, we have a watered down version of it. We call it a certified business enterprise program, but it's basically eligible to every business that's located here in the District of Columbia. And we need to have a minority business enterprise to support Black-owned, brown-owned businesses and contractors so they can access the nearly $1 billion in district government contracts,
right,
in a sheltered market, because we know that they struggle to compete when they don't have those types of unique opportunities. And so, I'm also considering doing a bill based on some of the things I've seen in California and other places where we require more diverse board leadership of businesses that are headquartered here in the District of Columbia. Why? Because I know that when we've got people that have the unique experiences of people of color on the boards, helping to make decisions and provide that sort of governance role of these corporations, we're more likely to see the types of leadership and decisions that empower Black-owned businesses to be able to compete more, given the disparities and discriminations that they've had to face over generations.
Awesome. Well, we're gonna do
quick thing.
I'm gonna put it on hold, Andre, and maybe you can blend this in. We're gonna do a 5-minute speed round, where you guys can ask each other questions, and maybe we'll go a little bit over depending on how much you guys get into it. But I'm gonna start, because how often do folks get to hear a council member talk to a banker and then talk to a luminary like Andre and talk to each other? So we're just sitting on the porch now, and Jasmine actually might be literally sitting on her porch right now, I believe. So I'll start with Jasmine. What's a question that you might have for the council member of Andre that we can sort of debate and go back and forth?
Andre, I think I kind of told you this before, but I want you to tell the world. As you read Know Your Price, we've got to acknowledge that folks want to stay in their neighborhood. They want to be there, and they want their homes to be valued properly. They want to make sure that they can attract economic development and businesses to their communities. What's the next book that you are going to put out? Just again, 1,200 of our closest friends. But also, what's the opportunity you think for engaging folks who really do want to stay and reinvest? What's the opportunity for them in your eyes, from both a community activism and engagement standpoint, an investment standpoint, as well as how can institutions be helpful?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because I'm actually writing another book, but it just gets to my relationship with cities. We need to concretize more research institutions or embed them more into cities. I work for the Metropolitan Policy Program where we do that, but Councilmember Duffy should not have to ask me or anyone else to do some of the studies that were mentioned. I work for the Brookings Institution. To be a good neighbor, we should be helping the city achieve many of its goals. Now, that requires different types of public-private partnerships, where it might be a city who funds a Brookings to do the study, but we have got to be more strategic about making sure think tanks and other organizations are being a good neighbor. Because, Know Your Price is a book, and it's just a tactic to just get into a city. That's it. It provides information, and and a lot of people find my information important, And it is, the data I roll out. I mean, President Biden in his executive orders in housing included my research, and I mean, it's everywhere. And so it's important, but we have got to, universities are anchor institutions, think tanks are anchor institutions, and we have got to be a good neighbor. And one final thing, we've got to stop producing so much disparity research. That all of us, all this research that comes out that says Black people need to catch up to white people sends a horrible message. That one, that white people are the standard, and it ignores the historical stuff that created these disparities. So we need to also look at a lot of asset framing in our work. And so the next book, the next report should be nuanced to serve local communities in a way that makes sense to Black and Brown communities. And we need to partner with the cities and others to make that happen.
I appreciate the pathology language. I'm a social worker by trade, so you're absolutely right in that. I appreciate it.
One last question amongst you, and I'm gonna, if you don't mind, council member, do you have a question for Jasmine? You get to talk directly to a banker in front of everyone. What's a question you'd have for her?
I would ask Jasmine, and I want to just say thank you. I don't know if I'm going to get a chance to do it later. I want to say thank you to all of you. I think this has been extraordinarily helpful for me to listen to some of the things you all are doing. I would ask Jasmine, in the role that I have, and given what I've been attempting to do, what's the one thing you think you would need from a policymaker in my position to support your work, really so that it has the sort of lasting, deep impacts to the entrepreneurs and the Black business owners that I talk to pretty regularly, who are trying to figure out how to survive through this pandemic, and importantly, how to grow and really stay in the nation's capital, where we see so many businesses shuttering and being displaced.
I appreciate that, because you mentioned earlier the work of CNHD as key to the DC Community Anchor Project. We helped launch that a few years ago, and you're really hitting the nail on the head. We realized that it took a collaborative kind of strategy to make sure that we had all of the players of DC and the community partners and the banks, as well, that you mentioned, as well as grant making institutions at the table. What I found helpful, and obviously Calvin's put me in the hot seat, because none of what I'm about to say is approved, and it's just Jasmine sitting in Hollis, Queens, telling you this. But what's interesting is I'm finding it helpful I get regular newsletters from my council members of, here are the things that I'm thinking about. I don't know exactly how it's going to shape up, but here are the key priorities I have. And generally, when we hear from council members, and I live in New York City, so New York City Council's a little different, it's very high level, and it's not concrete, at least of what the promised land looks like from some of the policies. And so if folks knew early on you're trying to save Black businesses and communities, or you're looking at succession planning, folks have probably already funded some stuff that you should know about. And that's at least an opportunity for you to hear and create a table for folks to come to you and share what they're learning and what not to do. The other thing is, we just launched, and after years in city, continually as a leader and an arranger in affordable housing, about $8 billion a year we do, with respect to actually financing projects, housing developments across the country. And Calvin knows this well, and he knows the team actually who's doing it. Soon we'll be able to tell you how we're investing in Black developers and fund managers who do these deals and are putting in housing across the country, and they've got projects. A part of that is, are there opportunities for folks to partner, with cities in advance? I mean, and I again, speaking at the risk of getting into trouble, but the more you have a chance to say, here's what I'm kicking around in my head, the better it is for someone to come in and complete it with you. But what also often happens is, Here's the full project. Where, as you as a bank, fit into this? And that's not partnership. It doesn't give us room to bring our best to the table. It doesn't give us room to figure out how to develop the financing structures, pipes that you need to make it work. And it doesn't create that onboarding that we're all looking for when it comes to which communities can benefit and win from those deals. And so I think it's that kind of early engagement and partnership. And I'm hoping that there's more of that in the future. And that you're experiencing it that way. But I think that's a piece for us to think about, aligning more.
Wow, I love it. That was, and I love the fact, and you guys have a rapport to be so candid about those challenges and that sort of upfront work that could actually help what we want to get out on the back end. So I appreciate just the willingness to say that out loud in front of, 1,200 of your closest friends.
We're sitting on the porch.
Wanted to check in with my host and see if there are any questions from the audience. Otherwise, we have lots of more robust discussion. I think there's lots of questions, so I'll tee this up for the host to come in and give us some.
Great. Thanks, Calvin, and thanks, panelists, and thanks to everybody who has sent questions. Absolutely, we've gotten many of them, more than we'll have time to. And I think we'll try to do this till about 12:55 and see how far we go, how far we get. So here's the first one for the panel, which is, I serve on my city's comprehensive planning committee. What can I do in my position to support Black and brown businesses?
Well, I'll be clear that we also need to specify commercial corridors and housing programs adjacent to those commercial corridors for investment. There are in cities where there are Black and brown people, particularly Black neighborhoods, many of these commercial corridors are languishing. The reason why I put sort of this label called Buy Back the Block, one, colloquially, we know what that means, but there are several blocks conveniently located adjacent to Black neighborhoods. And if we concentrate investment in those areas, essentially incubating businesses in those places, actually maybe even including incubators in those areas, rehabbing former municipal buildings, turning them into other more public spaces for commerce. If we develop those, but again, if you invest in place and not people, you will encourage gentrification. And so
Andre, just to their question though, their question is about, as a planner on their comp plan commission, how can they do what you're talking about?
So for me, it means using your zoning power, if you have it, to help make these things happen. I mean, because a lot of cities are now using various types of zones to encourage affordability, density, investment. And so I would say, make sure that you use the power that you have to plan those kind of activities.
Councilmember, you've probably been to a zoning hearing once or twice.
Yeah, in the District of Columbia, it's kind of unique that the council doesn't legislate zoning laws. And in many cases, I kind of appreciate that because it's really controversial. I will say though, we're actually going through our comprehensive planning process right now. And I was instrumental in offering and having my colleagues support language in our comprehensive plan to embed racial equity into its guiding principles and make it really a critical part of the district's planning process. I also think about the comprehensive planning process in the District of Columbia, both in terms of businesses, but also in terms of environmental justice. I think, when you look at the placement of industrial businesses over the years, it has had a negative impact on communities of color. And so I really added language on environmental justice, reflecting the reality that facilities emitting pollution, for example, have disproportionately impacted communities of color. And so that language that addresses some of the business placement also needs to think about and consider the historic discrimination and negative impact on communities of color so that they won't be oversaturated with businesses that don't provide the sorts of neighborhood serving amenities that most people want.
Awesome. Next question.
Okay, thank you. Given the emergence of web-based banking, aside from the critical improvement in equitable lending practices, what is the role of the community bank in building more equitable communities and community development?
So the role of community banks is to provide consumer products and services. Again, they're often storefront, embedded in communities, reflect the communities and the leadership that live and work in those places. I would say I'm really excited about the fact that a couple of months ago, we launched an effort with Google to look at bringing in community banks as well as 2 MDIs, or minority deposit taking institutions, through a new initiative called Plex. So if you Google that, it's actually an interesting platform to try to model out kind of the digital banking space and bringing in more community serving banks and MDIs. The challenge has been traditionally, the bigger banks are global. We're on our apps. We have a lot of different platforms and strategies to provide services and products surely on our phones. We know that Black and Brown communities have digital access, but when you look at the types of transactions they use and do on their phones, it's not banking as the top list of things that they do. So I think it's a way of making sure that, again, it's not an institution coming in to say, here's how we will engage banking in a community, but partnering with those institutions that are already has those consumer relationships and learning better ways and learning faster ways to bring them and their consumers into digital banking as a strategy. It's exciting, it's early days, but I think there are so many ways given the COVID environment. We heard from MDIs and CEOs over the summer when we kind of called everyone to say, how can we be really dig into the relationships we had? How do we expand those relationships? How do we bring on new relationships? Many of them had few branches. They were operating in an office where they were trying to provide services, and it was difficult given the social distancing rules. They wanted to manage the safety of everyone and their staff, as well as, make sure that they provided critical services. And so one of the things that we knew we did early on was put a $50 million PPP facility kind of together for MDIs, knowing that they needed to provide capital into communities, but didn't necessarily have the room on their books. They often were called for, PPP loans, but didn't have that source of resource. And so having built that plumbing and standing it up, what felt like overnight, and to Andre's point earlier, there's so many ways that banks, it's not just the change for a dollar moment. Black and Brown communities can be in the capital markets in meaningful ways. And what's wonderful is I think we're really trying to demonstrate as a large institution that brings both an investment banking side as well as a consumer banking side, that we could really be accretive for these firms and their consumers.
I want to make one point that will bring both, hopefully, the council member and Andre particularly in as well, which is, and this is true if you're working on smart growth issues, you're a planner, you're someone working at the comp plan level, you're a placemaker, you have to think about banks, just like Jasmine said, not just as change for a dollar, but also as social infrastructure.
Yeah.
And so you have to, as a planner, say, what are the reasons, what are the ways that communities catalyze their own revitalization? And one of the gaps that are missing, it's not just a wealth gap, it's also a gap in the social infrastructure that binds communities together. And banks provided one physical manifestation of that social infrastructure. So I just wanted to bring Andre and the council member in, because I know there's neighborhoods in DC where when the bank left, that was sort of one of the few places that everybody went. Councilmember Andre?
I think you're spot on, and I think one of the things I love about The Color of Money and what Marissa Baradaran says in her book, which I think is also spot on, is that you can't, the Black banks and community banks are so incredibly important to helping to support and empower and sustain minority communities, but you can't rely on those banks to do the work of achieving wealth equality without changing the environment in which they operate, right? So if you've got a poor community and you've got a Black bank in a poor community, you know, I think you're asking too much to expect a bank will be sustainable in terms of trying to, you know, give loans and to do the sorts of things that you know these majority banks do in wealthy communities. And so I think it's important for people to recognize that we've got to help minority banks help minorities in communities that are traditionally and historically been underserved. And so I think she also points out that really when we think about, and this has been helpful in the work that I've done because I look at it when I thought about how I might be able to support an industrial bank, right? Banks really reflect the economic conditions of the communities, what she says. They cannot change in and of themselves the economic conditions of those communities. And so what do governments do to support them? What is the private sector doing to support them? I think it's all so incredibly important. When I look at how much money the District of Columbia, you know, deposits and goes through these large banks, I think about how I can get industrial involved in that. But I also know that I don't want industrial to bite off more than it can chew. And so I'm looking at if there's some mentor protege types of relationships like we've seen in the federal government 8A program that we might be able to do with financial institutions. I want to support that. And to the extent I can leverage it because we've got, you know, billions of dollars coming through these banks, then I'm going to use my position to create those types of relationships, because ultimately the stronger industrial bank is, the better off these communities of color are going to be in the District of Columbia.
Yeah, you know, both of you hit the nail on the head. Again, it's hard for me to add anything but accolade, but I will try. You know, banks are a relationship-driven industry, and for community banks, they're very high touch, low volume, and so we still need the high touch, right? But we also need the investment to increase the amount of volume. In so many different ways. You're talking about moving things into a secondary market. I mean, there's so many capacity issues there. But now is the time to do this. When you see literally trillions of dollars being moved, this is probably the only time you can actually build capacity in the way that we're describing. And so if you do give to a city or a JP or a fintech company, some of what they should be responsible for is to provide the infrastructure to these community banks so that they can continue to have their relationships to distribute product at a higher volume. And so and they're saying that very thing. There has to be a way to maximize the social capital that community banks offer, but still build capacity so they can take on more volume.
Awesome. And just to that point, you know, city's not alone. There are a number of banks, but you know, we've committed $100 million to MDIs, 50 million in growth capital. Industrial is a partner of ours in our mentor protege strategy. And to your point, we're definitely working with our bankers to find more ways to build them into not just capital markets, but also having them be a part of, as you said, the councilman said, bringing them into deploying and actually being a bank in an kind of a commercial and an investment kind of way. So there's a lot to come. A lot hasn't been announced yet, but I'm excited that Doyle is, you know, top on your list in DC. The other thing I would say is, you know, I remember a couple of years ago, and I'm looking at, you know, we talked about the color of money. The other one is how the other half banks. Yeah. How are we as community minded folks and folks who are focused on racial and social justice really thinking about the economic engagement of the community and the community groups that are required for that to happen? And so, you know, Andre said, you know, high touch, low volume. A part of when we looked at our racial equity announcement, the question was, what's the capacity building that we need to invest in communities for some of this work to really get to scale? Where are the gaps? Do we have the right nonprofit players and the right sector players at the table for us to accelerate and move into a whole nother transformative space? I think that's the thing that we need to think about. And for any of the grant makers on the phone and any other kind of community investors, if you will, is to say, Andre's point is right. We've got a window opportunity. There's trillions of dollars, billions of dollars from companies all over the world saying we need to invest in this. What are we building so that we can take full advantage of this moment to really make it work in the way that we know is both equitable, inclusive, and really gets the results we want? And I don't know that we've taken that additional work under our wing to really focus on it and to really move as fast as what feels like, and Andre said a month, the man's been president for a week. So a lot has happened in just 1 week. And so how are we going to run in a sustainable way to really realize what we want to see in communities and in the institutions that we are a part of?
Right. And what you said, Jasmine, was so important. I know as Smart Growth America, we've talked about this. We spend a lot of time doing what we call coalition building. And I said yesterday as my kickoff remarks that smart growth is as much a mindset and a map as it is a movement. And part of that movement is what can national organizations like ours, we partner with local on the ground frontline organizations to help build the coalitions. We play our role, we stay in our lane, but we're able to bring that national sense of what's going on, what has worked, do these type of reports, and then give them the tools and to have their own agency to both decide what their vision is, but then help them implement what they've decided. And so these public-private partnerships and this notion of social infrastructure and the ability of a community to have capacity to get to where they want to go requires not just public-private partnerships, but also the type of partnerships that are sort of national local. And that's what we're trying to do, build these coalitions, do these convenings to bring these conversations to bear and then get out the way. And speaking of getting out the way, more questions from the audience.
Yes, thanks, Calvin. Yes, we do have many, and they're still coming in. Next one is, are there any dynamics that are different for Black and Brown owned businesses in rural and ex-urban communities as compared to urban ones that are or will be on the front lines of sprawl?
Ooh.
You know, what's interesting, I study Black majority cities, and you're actually seeing
and some of those are rural, right? Correct?
What's that?
Many people, when they hear Black majority cities, they think of big-time cities, big cities.
I talk about ones that are 1,000 people, 15,000 people. So I'm including those. But you're actually seeing a small spike in home ownership among millennials who are actually moving into these areas because you see the value. I hate always getting too wonky, but because you're seeing the valuation in these areas, and because of the COVID, people are saving their money. They're not going to the mall. They actually are buying homes in these areas because they can afford them. So the next level is, how can you develop these places so that folks aren't compelled to move? And so, there's actually a resurgence of sorts. In addition, let's not forget about those small towns that have anchor institutions like colleges and universities, HBCUs. These are also great destination points because most of us know that universities and colleges are often shield or ward off a lot of the negative impacts of a recession. They're generally better off in bad times. So it's good to move to a Grambling, for instance, Louisiana. You get your entertainment, you get football, you get school, you get a lot of good things, you get a diverse community. And so I actually think when you're planning, understand that these demographic shifts change over courses of 20 years. Some, sometimes it's moved to the city, the inner city core of the big cities. Other times, as you saw in Georgia, they're moving to the suburbs, they're moving to the outskirts.
Right.
It's changing the political dynamic.
Right.
And so you have, obviously, I mean, Georgia turned blue largely because people are moving out of Atlanta and into the suburbs.
Right. Right.
So we should also think of ourselves in a metropolitan type of way, going into the outskirts, and because we're still part of that larger ecosystem.
And I want to jump on that point also to the point of the question. A couple of the challenges for rural America really get to, and the solution set, frankly, gets to this question of metropolitanness. So
Yeah.
one of the challenges, if you're a Black and brown business in a smaller town or rural America, do you have broadband access that allows you to get to a broader metropolitan customer base that can actually support a business, that you can have a business model that actually can survive? So that's one. Two, and this kind of relates to Jasmine, the downside to banks being a relationship business is that if you're in a small town and you're a Black and brown business, it might be harder to have those relationships. So the more national banks can say, they can take some of the individual local decision making that then would sort of double down sometimes on systemic racism, but allow Black and brown businesses to be able to access capital resources that don't only come from the one or two sources that are in their community, will also help them. I mean, a lot of the answer to this question really is, and we do rural work, basically every day. I always like to say to folks, we're not Smart Growth Urban, we're Smart Growth America. And one of the things we know is it's connectivity, connectivity, connectivity. We mean that in the technical sense, we mean that in the access to capital sense, and we mean that in the transportation and mobility infrastructure sense. And so long as Black and brown businesses in smaller places in rural America don't have connectivity, whether it's about capital, whether it's about mobility options, or connectivity to the customer base that will allow them to have a working business model, they'll never survive. So those are the type of things we work on. I don't know if Jasmine, you had any particular thoughts?
I completely agree.
Awesome. Other questions?
Okay. Regarding the use of community benefits agreements and similar tools that are rooted in community priorities, can any of the panelists point to recent examples of leveraging benefits from large institutions, public infrastructure, or redevelopment projects that are contributing to BIPOC economic opportunities and wealth building strategies?
Councilman,
ahead,
anything
Andre.
come to mind?
I have not seen them specifically to the extent I think they're creating wealth building strategies. In fact, I'm having conversations internally with my staff. I know that one of my colleagues has a large project in a part of the city. If you're familiar with Washington, D.C., it's in Ward 8, where there is a number of development projects that are occurring. One in particular, he's actually looking, and I'm looking at this too to see if they're best practices. So I'd love for somebody to put that in the chat if they've heard about it, where the people who live in these communities that are being impacted, rather than do the traditional community benefits agreement that I've seen, where these large developers might give 10,000 to this or do a scholarship for a university or something like that, they actually have an opportunity to buy into some of the equity. It seems to be, in theory, something that is worthwhile. In practice, a lot more complicated when you talk about sort of the cycle that you need this equity to be invested in these projects before you see any return. When we know a lot of folks, even when it comes to just regular depository institutions, they're putting their money in their bank. It's not staying there very long, particularly in this environment that we're experiencing during the pandemic. And so I wish I had better examples. It is something that I'm looking at because there's been lots of large scale economic development projects in the District of Columbia where I've seen traditional community benefit agreements that have not really worked to support and sustain the communities over the time that these developments have been in place. They're getting, government benefits in the form of tax abatements or tax increment financing. And you look at these projects over the course of 10, 15, or 30 years, and you don't see the return directly impacting these individuals in these communities. In fact, in many cases, you see some of them being displaced.
But one thing I will say, part of how I respond to that question is to not only focus on agreements, but also go back to legislation. So the opportunity zones federal tax incentive could be modified to allow residents of those communities a way to buy into the projects that would receive opportunity zone capital by investing their own disposable income. Right now, you have to have a certain type of taxable gain that you then want to deploy and follow and jump through a number of hoops. It essentially makes it challenging to find Black and brown people or just folks in a particular community who fit all of the metrics and are then able to invest in actual businesses or projects in their community. And so we've definitely put in our opportunity zones report, our unrealized gains report, just the concept of, as opposed to only just thinking about community benefits agreements, which are happening once the project is sort of, on the move, which is, are there other legislative means that we can allow basically market-based incentives so that community members can actually be some of the investors, and therefore it's another wealth building opportunity. And it's another way to get to a community benefit, but it takes out the need of having a full negotiation, because you've seen it in many, if you go to Detroit or a number of other cities, part of the challenge is by the time you finish negotiating on a public-private partnership basis, the community benefit agreement itself, some of the moment you've already missed. Some of the money that's being expended has already happened. And so can we create market-based incentives that would just work as the market is working, so folks can become part of that community benefit without having to have a negotiation?
Yeah, but I must have missed, I read almost everything that you all publish, so I don't know how I missed that, but I'd love to be able to see that and try to do something like that here in the District of Columbia. I'm also looking at opportunity zones, and we made some minor modifications recently. The mayor made some minor modifications, which I supported. But I'm also looking at opportunity zones in a way that we want to prevent displacement. So to the extent you've got these opportunity zones that are clearly defined by geography, maybe doing sort of a TIF approach, tax increment financing approach, where you capture these investments start to flow, you start seeing increases in property taxes, maybe they're greater incomes, rather than allowing that benefit, that increment, that increase in taxes to flow back to the general fund to the benefit of every District of Columbia resident, capturing that benefit in some sort of special fund created and utilized specifically for those opportunity zone areas. It goes right back to them to prevent displacement that could occur as a result of increased investments.
Oh, we'd love to
No,
talk
I don't
to
think
you
it's
more
an
about that. Yeah.
No, I was
Jasmine.
just going to add, I don't think it's a opportunity zone, but I would say I saw an interesting model in Portland, Oregon, actually, in the historic Black neighborhood, where Mercy Corps was leading an effort to actually do some sort of community wealth building or community asset preservation strategy, where local residents had the ability to invest in the commercial corridor in that neighborhood, and it actually enabled them to become the investors. They were developing a whole governance structure and a model around it, and they worked with a ton of lawyers and their elected officials to get that model up and going. So that was interesting because it was having the community residents reinvest in the community themselves at a low level, which mirrors I believe there are policies in California which allow individual residents to participate in economic development opportunities as an investor. And those kind of waivers are hard to come by. But the models, I would say, I would call Mercy Corps and find out about that model in Portland. if they're still interested. The other is I would talk to ICA group. A lot of the work that they're doing is trying to figure out what are the models of shared wealth, shared prosperity approaches. And they've done a lot of work in the policy, the valuation space, and making sure that owners and communities have an opportunity to lead and invest and benefit from what happens in their neighborhood, with a lens to preserve communities and prevent displacement.
Well, and this is why I thought this panel would be great, because you guys can bring examples not just locally but nationally. Council member, I also note in audience as well in the chat another example of a community benefits agreement that's in Cleveland, Ohio, in the Clark Fulton neighborhood. Gets to these kind of wealth building opportunities. And this is actually a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. So it gets to the brown and the black and brown. I think we have time for one last question for the audience, and then we'll probably talk about some recommended materials and go from there.
Great, thanks, Calvin. And actually, our next question is from our friend Regina Langton in the EPA, who's asking, what is a major first step that federal agencies such as EPA and its partners could take to contribute to the goals that you've mentioned today?
Andre, you looked up like you had.
Well, I actually, and this might be repeating myself. I think President Biden in his only week, I'm glad you corrected me, week in office with these executive orders, is making a good start. I mean, I think that he can be the climate president, and we need to make sure that he upholds equity in that space. We have an opportunity. And so I'm encouraged by what I've seen in housing and in criminal justice and other areas. I have not read all the executive orders yet. There's about 30 of them so far. But I'm hoping that in that space, he can contribute to this conversation.
I'll answer one piece of that, particularly if, the question being from Regina from the Environmental Protection Agency. One thing is to think about environmental justice as also small business justice. If you go back to one of the things the council member was talking about, which is the placement of industrial type businesses in only certain neighborhoods, but you also have the converse, which is what are the environmental downsides to where we place these type of industrial businesses? If we put them adjacent to and in predominantly Black and brown communities, that also inures to the detriment of Black and brown consumer businesses. You can't be a Black owned or a Hispanic owned coffee shop right next to an incinerator plant. So as the EPA, you can start, I think one of the challenges, and I thought of a new podcast name, it's called Jasmine Has the Data. And I think one of the things, my answer to all federal agencies, if you are listening to this right now, all 1,000+ of you, you work at a federal agency. One of the challenges that the council member talked about and is working on locally is that there is no data. We actually don't know some of the challenges we want to face and problems we want to solve. The federal government either hasn't or stopped accumulating the data to give us the information to prioritize our resources to solve the problem. So where are negative externalities, certain types of businesses that have downsides environmentally, where are they being placed? What neighborhoods are those in? Focus the federal resources in both funding organizations that are going to work both on the ground from an advocacy standpoint on these issues, but also either funding or providing usable data to actually solve the problems. Because one of our challenges is we actually know a lot of the problems, but we don't have actionable data that we can that any community anywhere in the country can compare and contrast and understand where they stand and say, man, I didn't realize I'm 1,012th on a list of 1,013 cities. They don't actually even know that to know the urgency of where they need to fight. So I would talk about data.
I think it's worth pointing out too that President Biden's executive order on racial equity establishes a data working group within the federal government. So I think that's very important. It's something that we accounted for when we did the REACH Act locally. In fact, I just had a conversation yesterday with the council's head of the Office on Racial Equity around data, because I want to make sure that we don't find ourselves a year from now looking back at these executive agencies under the mayor and saying, hey, we don't have the data. No, let's start to work and make sure that infrastructure is in place now so that we can move the ball on these things and not have to play catch up. I also say, I think that the federal government and the agencies could really start to use some of the language that the president is using as well. When he talks about in that executive order, the unbearable human cost of systemic racism, I mean, powerful. When he talks about the missed opportunities, right? I mean, he pointed out that there would be an additional $5 trillion in gross domestic product if we were to close the racial wealth gap over the next 5 years. And so I think that kind of language really cuts across some of the racial divides. I mean, people understand when you start to talk about a $5 trillion missed opportunity. I mean, I know in DC, according to the National Equity Atlas, the income of Black residents in DC would have to increase by 175% to be racially equitable. And the result of that equity would be a 55% gain in GDP in our city. And so that would be the highest of any state in the nation if we were able to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish with racial equity.
Awesome. Well, let me let you each have a speed round, 1 minute sort of final thoughts, and then we'll turn it back over to the host. Before your final thoughts, I just want to thank all of you because I love this panel not only because of what you were able to say, but what I was able to learn just in listening to each of you. So just wanted to thank you for that. And any closing thoughts on anything you heard or anything else you wanted to say? We'll first go to Jasmine, then to Dr. Perry, and then we'll end with the council member, the Honorable Council Member McDuffie.
No, I appreciate this opportunity and definitely an invigorating conversation. It's not the normal dialogue that I have external to the work that I do every day. But I would say that, again, we have to be focused. We have to move quickly. We have to be intentional. And we have to stand with the courage and conviction to tell the truth when the numbers don't lie. And I think, again, every time I hear that $16 trillion number, $5 billion number, I know that the work of folks and economists who've been pulling together data to really make that business case is starting to sink in. But to the councilman's point, we've got to show how that manifests itself locally. At the end of the day, the racial wealth gap is a problem. It is killing all of us financially and economically at a global level. It's impacted and shrunk what we could have. And so the opportunity for us is, I agree with what's been said, our fates are tied. They are tied. And I think if you haven't noticed in the last year that that's more true than ever before in history, I think that's something that's important for us to acknowledge. And quite frankly, the moment is now. We're sitting in different seats around the country working in this space. The question is, what are you going to do in your role that allows that truth telling, that data to speak for itself, and then act with the conviction and partnership and courage that's necessary to really implement the necessary policies, partner across projects and programs, and really ensure to bring folks into the work that you do before you do it, so that it is equitable, it has additional accountability, but also that it is fair and really accretive to everyone, not just for one community.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Andre.
Oh, first of all, I want to say thank you for having me. This has been an incredible panel. Shout out to all that are involved and those who are not on camera. I know many of you don't get the props publicly, but I just want to say all the folks behind the scenes, this has been a pleasurable experience. I just tweeted out an opportunity for many planners out there. I'm partnering with the Ashoka organization, and we have launched a $1 million collaborative competition where we want entrepreneurs, organizations to work on the issue of housing devaluation. So if you're interested in it, we'll be giving away prizes upwards of, totaling $1 million. So if you're interested in working on these issues, we want to incentivize this work. So I try my best to leave you with the resources, and hopefully you'll participate in this challenge because we need you.
Thank you, Andre. Councilman, bring us home.
Again, I want to thank you, Calvin, for all that you all are doing. This is such an incredibly important discussion. I'm really privileged to be a part of it. I hope that the folks who participated were able to get something out of it. I know I certainly have been able to. I'll say, I think we need to really move away from romanticizing these ideas around economic development and support for small businesses writ large, right? We hear people say that small businesses are the backbone of local economies, but then you don't see the money flow in the places where it's needed the most. And simply placing the same value on these things across the board is not a recipe for success. Again, there is a tendency to fall back on this idea that if we just support small businesses, any small businesses, we're going to have thriving, interesting and inclusive communities. We're not. There's less thought to who owns them, who they employ, how they impact neighborhoods, who has the access to capital to open and sustain these businesses. And if policymakers and practitioners, people in positions like mine, continue to do that, then we're going to fundamentally miss the point.
Mhm.
Jasmine just said it. The numbers don't lie, right? It's crystal clear. We know what the problem is. It is the history of discrimination and racism that really has manifested itself in these stark racial disparities that continue to exist today. And so we know that there's certain investments that we can make in our small businesses that are going to accelerate displacement and gentrification. Let's acknowledge it. We know that some Black and Brown owned small businesses may need more targeted or differential support. Let's acknowledge it and do it. We've got to approach supporting Black owned businesses, as with all policy, I would say, looking through a lens of racial equity. And so we all know, again, what the problem is. Let's not hide behind it. Let's call it out. Let's talk about it, even if it makes us uncomfortable. Anything less, frankly, is nothing more than putting lipstick on a pig.
Awesome. Well, thank you all, not only for your time, but for your thought leadership. And thanks to the audience for being here today. I'm going to hand this back off to our hosts to make some final remarks.
Thanks, Calvin. And with that, we are about to close out our second day of the Smart Growth America's Equity Summit. But before we go, Dr. Andre Perry's terrific book, Know Your Price, was mentioned many times today. Andre has been generous enough to offer a few signed copies of his book that we will give away at random to a few participants who complete the post-summit survey. So look for that in your inboxes on Thursday or Friday this week after the summit wraps up. As mentioned earlier, please check out Unrealized Gains, an important SGA report that examined whether or not opportunity zones are having the desired impact on small businesses, specifically minority-owned and legacy businesses. And finally, I'll mention for those who are trying to claim their AICP-CM credits, the number that we shared earlier is accurate, may not be available to post till later this afternoon. Along with the SGA report, we urge that you take a look at these other resources from our esteemed panelists. Council Member McDuffie introduced the REACH Act in the District of Columbia Council. As mentioned, Dr. Andre Perry's terrific book, Know Your Price, is well worth your time. And this report from Citi is just one of many that Jasmine and her team have recently produced. We are dropping links to all of these materials in the chat. After the summit wraps on Thursday, we'll be sending out a suite of other information, links, and reports that have been referenced throughout the programs this week. So be sure to join us tomorrow for the final day of the summit. Smart Growth America's Beth Osborne will briefly explain and unpack Transportation for America's recent policy proposal, written with Third Way, on how the federal government can start to undo the damage of urban renewal projects, like the construction of the interstate highway system that displaced millions of Americans and especially harmed communities of color and continues to do so today. That will be a poignant lead into our final panel that will more closely examine the role of government in undoing the harm caused by the interstate highway system. That panel will be led by Mary Skelton Roberts, co-director of climate at the Barr Foundation. She will be joined by our esteemed panelist, Dr. Destiny Thomas, founder and CEO of the Thrivance Group, Melvin Giles, community leader and advocate in the Rondo neighborhood of St. Paul, Minnesota, and Minnesota State Representative Rena Warren. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to having you back here tomorrow for the summit's final day.